World War I was not only a war of bullets and explosions, but a slow, grinding descent into horror that reshaped what human beings considered normal, especially for the men trapped in the trenches, where death was no longer an event but a constant presence breathing beside them. Soldiers lived, slept, ate, and sometimes laughed only a few feet away from decomposing corpses, friends, enemies, and strangers alike, because removing the dead was often more dangerous than leaving them where they fell. In muddy trench walls, bodies were used as structural support, packed into the earth to stop collapses, their uniforms and bones quietly merging with the soil. The stench of rot was so constant that many soldiers stopped noticing it altogether. Letters home mention a strange, sweet smell as casually as rain. Rats, bloated and fearless, fed on the dead at night and sometimes during the day, chewing through faces, fingers, and stomachs, growing so large that soldiers joked about them being as big as cats. Lice infested every layer of clothing, crawling through seams, laying eggs in collars, and biting relentlessly, causing trench fever, a painful illness treated as an inconvenience rather than a medical emergency. Washing was a luxury, clean clothes a distant memory, and men went weeks or months without properly bathing, their skin cracked, infected, and crawling. Soldiers developed trench foot, where constant exposure to cold, wet mud caused flesh to rot while still attached to living bone, leading to amputations performed in overcrowded field hospitals with minimal anesthesia. What makes this especially disturbing is that none of this was considered unusual. It was simply part of daily life. New recruits arriving at the front were shocked at first, gagging at the smell and horror, but within weeks they adapted, stepping over corpses without looking down, eating meals beside the dead, and sleeping through artillery fire that shook the earth like an angry god. The human mind learned to normalize the unthinkable because survival demanded it. Fear was not eliminated, was buried under routine. Soldiers learned which screams could be ignored and which meant immediate danger. They learned to tell the sound of incoming shells from outgoing ones, sometimes mistaking death for distance. Nights were often worse than days, filled with ghostly flares, whispered prayers, and the moans of wounded men trapped in no man's land, crying for help that no one dared give. These cries could last for days, slowly weakening until silence finally claimed them. Officers rarely ordered rescues, knowing that one life was not worth several more. This too became normal. Compassion was rationed like ammunition. Even children lied about their age to join. Boys as young as 15 sent into this nightmare, handed rifles taller than themselves, expected to behave like men while witnessing horrors that would haunt them forever. Shell shock, what we now call PTS, was widely misunderstood and treated as cowardice. Soldiers who trembled, cried, or froze were mocked, punished, or even executed for lack of moral fiber. The idea that the mind could be wounded was not yet accepted. Men were expected to endure endless bombardments that shattered nerves as surely as bones. Some went blind or mute with no physical injury, their bodies intact but their minds broken. Doctors shocked patients with electricity, forced them back to the front, or locked them away. All of this rotting bodies, disease, psychological collapse, and relentless death was absorbed into the definition of normal life during World War I. It was a world where survival required emotional numbness, where horror lost its power, through repetition, and where humanity learned terrifyingly fast how to live alongside death as if it were just another neighbor in the trench. Asterisk if life in the trenches broke the body and spirit. The medical care of World War I often finished the job, revealing another layer of horror that was disturbingly accepted as normal. Field hospitals were overwhelmed beyond imagination, turning churches, schools, barns, and even railway stations into makeshift operating rooms where surgeons worked non-stop for days without rest. The wounded arrived in endless waves, men missing. Jaws, faces torn apart by shrapnel, limbs hanging by threads of flesh, eyes burned blind by gas or explosions. There was no time for gentleness. Triage meant deciding, sometimes in seconds, who would live, who might live, and who would be left to die with a shot of morphine or none at all. Anesthesia was scarce. Ether and chloroform ran out quickly, and many amputations were performed. While soldiers were conscious, held down by orderlies as bones were sawed through, screams echoed through the wards until they became background noise, something doctors learned to tune out in order to keep working. Infection was rampant. Antibiotics did not yet exist, so surgeons amputated aggressively, often removing healthy tissues simply to stay ahead of gangrene. Piles of severed arms and legs were stacked outside operating tents like firewood, sometimes taller than the men who had lost them. Flies swarmed everything, spreading disease from wound to wound. Surgeons wiped their hands on aprons stiff with dried blood, sterilization a luxury in the chaos. Facial injuries were especially common and especially horrifying. Bullets and shell fragments tore mouths away, shattered jaws, and destroyed noses, leaving men unable to eat, speak, or even be recognized as human. These broken faces were hidden from public view after the war, their existence quietly erased because they reminded society of what had truly been done. Meanwhile, poison gas introduced a new kind of terror that redefined cruelty. Chlorine, phosgen, and mustard gas crept silently across battlefields, heavier than air, sinking into trenches where soldiers slept. Gas masks were primitive and often unreliable. Men fumbled to put them on in time, sometimes suffocating in their own panic. Those who failed were left coughing up their lungs, eyes melting, skin blistering as if burned from the inside. Death by gas was slow and agonizing, yet commanders continued to deploy it because it was effective. Soldiers were trained to accept gas attacks as just another hazard of war, even joking grimly about it in letters home. Doctors studied the effects closely, documenting how lungs filled with fluid, how blindness could be temporary or permanent, how survivors sometimes died weeks later from complications. This knowledge, gained through suffering, was considered progress. Experimental treatments were common and often cruel. Electric shocks to cure shell shock, forced re-exposure to explosions to prove courage, crude reconstructive surgeries, performed again and again on the same patient as surgeons learned through trial and error. Psychological trauma was medicalized only to the extent that it could be controlled. Compassion was secondary to returning men to the front. Soldiers who refused were labeled malingerers, punished, or executed. Children back home were told stories of bravery and honor, while behind the lines men were transformed into test subjects in a brutal laboratory of war. Even blood transfusions were risky, done without proper matching, sometimes killing the very men they were meant to save. Yet within this nightmare, doctors and nurses normalized the unimaginable. They ate meals beside the dying, slept among the wounded, and learned to function without emotional collapse. What shocks us today is not just the cruelty of these practices, but how quickly they became routine. Pain was expected. Death was efficient. Suffering was measured, recorded, and filed away. In World War I, medicine did not merely heal it. Adapted to mass destruction, and in doing so, made horror systematic, professional, and terrifyingly normal. As the war dragged on, the most terrifying battlefield became the human mind, where fear, exhaustion, and endless violence eroded sanity in ways the commanders neither understood nor cared to understand. Soldiers lived under constant artillery, bombardment, sometimes for weeks without pause, the earth shaking so violently that trenches collapsed and buried men alive, leaving them to suffocate while their comrades listened helplessly. The sound of shelling never truly stopped. Even in moments of quiet, many soldiers heard phantom explosions, their nerves permanently rewired by terror. This psychological destruction, later known as shell shock, was everywhere, men shaking uncontrollably, staring blankly, unable to speak, crying like children, or wandering aimlessly through gunfire, but instead of compassion, they were met with suspicion and cruelty. Military leaders feared that acknowledging mental injury would weaken morale, so breakdowns were labeled cowardice or moral failure. Soldiers who froze in battle or refused to advance were court-martialed in minutes, sometimes executed at dawn in front of firing squads made up of their own comrades, who were ordered to aim low to avoid killing instantly, a final act of cruelty, meant as punishment. These executions were kept quiet. Families told their sons had died honorably, while the truth was buried alongside them. Propaganda at home painted a completely different picture. Posters showed clean uniforms, noble charges, smiling heroes marching off to adventure, while newspapers glorified sacrifice and victory, hiding the mud, blood, and madness consuming an entire generation. Civilians were encouraged to shame young men who had not enlisted, women handing out white feathers to those deemed cowards, unaware or unwilling to know that courage at the front often meant surviving one more day without losing your mind. Soldiers learned to wear emotional armor, suppressing empathy because caring too much made survival impossible. Friendships were intense but short-lived. You might share a joke with a man in the morning and bury him by nightfall, if burial was even possible. Grief became dangerous, something to be postponed indefinitely. Some soldiers wrote farewell letters every night, expecting death by morning. Others stopped writing entirely, unable to explain a world that felt unreal even to them. Alcohol abuse was rampant, used to dull fear and force sleep when the guns briefly fell silent. Officers tolerated it because sober men often could not function in some units. Self-inflicted wounds became a desperate escape. Soldiers shot themselves in the hand or foot, risking execution because pain felt preferable to another assault. Even religion was twisted by the war chaplains preached obedience and sacrifice, blessing weapons and comforting the dying, while privately struggling with their own loss of faith. Time itself became distorted. Days blurred together in an endless cycle of waiting and terror, punctuated by sudden violence. When soldiers returned home on leave, many felt alienated, unable to reconnect with civilian life, disturbed by silence, crowds, or simple happiness. They were already ghosts, long before the war ended. What is most chilling is how all of this was normalized by necessity and authority. Mental collapse was treated as discipline failure. Execution was called justice. Lies were called patriotism. And millions accepted it because the alternative questioning the war itself felt impossible. World War I did not just kill bodies. It quietly trained societies to ignore psychological suffering, to accept cruelty as order, and to mistake endurance for honor, leaving scars that would shape the world long after the guns finally fell. Silent. When the guns finally fell silent and World War I officially ended, the world rushed to celebrate peace. But beneath the parades and treaties lay a silence far more disturbing than the noise of battle. Millions returned home physically alive but psychologically shattered, carrying invisible wounds that society neither wanted to see nor knew how to heal. These men were expected to simply resume normal life, to forget the trenches, the screams, the smell of decay, and the faces of the dead, as if horror could be switched off like a light. Many could not sleep without nightmares. Others could not sleep at all. Loud noises sent them diving for cover. Crowds made them panic, and silence felt unbearable because it reminded them of the moments before bombardment. Families noticed changes, but lacked language for what they saw. Fathers who drank too much, husbands who stared through walls, sons who returned colder, quieter, and distant. The term shell shock slowly entered public awareness, but it was often framed as weakness rather than injury, leaving countless veterans isolated and ashamed. Governments, eager to move forward, minimized long-term care, offering medals instead of therapy, honor instead of understanding. Meanwhile, entire landscapes remained poised and broken. Unexploded shells lay buried in fields. Gas residue lingered in the soil, and farmers continued to unearth bones decades later, a grim reminder that the war had never truly left. Monuments were erected, listing names without stories, turning complex lives into stone symbols of sacrifice. While the ugliest truths of the war were quietly erased from textbooks and public memory, the lost generation was not just a poetic phrase. It described a cohort of people robbed of youth, innocence, and trust in authority. Many artists, writers, and thinkers who survived struggled to articulate what they had seen, producing works filled with disillusionment, bitterness, and a deep sense of betrayal. What makes this legacy especially unsettling is how easily the world accepted the suffering as necessary, how quickly nations reframed mass death as meaningful, and how little accountability followed. The war normalized industrial-scale killing, taught societies to measure success in body counts, and proved that ordinary people could be trained to endure unimaginable cruelty if it was presented as duty. These lessons did not fade. They carried forward into future conflicts, shaping warfare, propaganda, and the treatment of soldiers for generations. Today, when we look back at World War I, the creepiest realization is not just what happened, but how much of it was considered normal, reasonable, and unavoidable at the time. The trenches, the gas, the executions, the psychological collapses were not accidents, but systems, built and maintained by human decisions. Remembering this matters because forgetting allows repetition. World War I stands as a warning, written in mud and blood, reminding us that when horror becomes routine, humanity is the first casualty. And the echoes of that normalization can still be felt in the modern world, long after the last soldier fell silent.